This feels like a homecoming for me, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to see you guys here. This last couple of weeks has been sort of crazy for me. My book came out exactly, I think, a week ago now, and it's kind of been a wild ride. And the number one question, I get is like, how does it feel? And I'm like, Nana, how does it feel? How does it feel? And I'm always just kind of which part? Some parts are kind of weird. Like, for example, despite this hat, I'm way too awkward to be getting my photo taken as much as it's getting taken. I think I was in LA having to do a photo shoot, and it was 2 hours long. And I think I'm the kind of awkward where if I take 2 hours of photos, you might get 3-4 good pictures. So I just feel like I'm kind of disappointing photographers. They had me doing all types of poses. They were like, why don't you take a step and whip around like this, Let your arm swing. They're like, no, let your arm swing. Just let it swing. And I'm like, I don't know how much you want my arm to swing. I don't know how much it's going to change my face, but but I'll do it. But yeah, the question is always like, how does it feel? Tell us how it feels. You're getting reviewed. What's that like? And that part, it's sort of humbling. A lot of the people who review your book end up being a lot smarter than you. And so that's something you have to encounter. I think the editor for the New York Times Book Review wrote, Nana has a lot of bravura. And my initial response was sort of like, your mother has bravura, How dare you? Then I, get my dictionary out. Oh, actually, I'm so sorry. Thank you very much for your kind words. I appreciate you very sincerely. So yeah, some parts are weird, and some parts are humbling. Yeah, everywhere I go, people ask me, how does it feel? And you're doing this work, you're writing these stories, and they're sort of, political. And I was talking earlier today about, that people asking me, why do you write these political stories? Like, what's it about politics? And I'm sort of at the point where I'm just like, what would you have me write instead? And my new response, I think, is going to be like, if the house is on fire, I'm not going to talk about what's in the fridge. So, thank you. All this burning, and I'm just like, well, there's some cucumbers, some lettuce. So I thought maybe I'd start with just a piece of an essay I wrote that appeared in the Paris Review about why I write, and then I'll go through the book and read just a little bit of a couple of stories. I'm thinking sort of like the sampler you get at Chili's, the appetizer sampler. Give you a little sampler of a couple of stories. But this is that essay titled Why Do You Write Political Stories? I was in college when Trayvon Martin was murdered. In response, I created an anonymous pamphlet, an artistic response to the atrocity. His killing deserved our outrage. Late one night, at 5 a.m., I scattered 500 different copies of this pamphlet all over this campus. And it's funny, I went to bed basically thinking, what, we did it. I fixed racism, go to bed. And I went to bed expecting a revival, a conversation, something. When I got up the next morning, nothing had happened. We had pretty much just littered. That summer, I was at a barbecue in Riverside Park when Trayvon's murderer was acquitted. I remember getting the notification on my phone. I felt exposed, fragile. I had been partying just a minute before. Years later, writing the Finklestein Five, the first story in this book, I tried to translate the many ways in which the justice system is often a cruel joke for Black people. I want to express the feeling of always being perceived as a threat by so many. The completion of that story was the closest I've ever come to a breakthrough. And it was the second time in my life that I wanted people to read what I'd written, even if my name wasn't attached. As a writer, I'm interested in the ways we dehumanize each other. I'm interested in our capacity for good, despite the insidious hatred and fear all around us. All the stories in Friday Black, including the story Finklestein Five, were tough to write, and yet in that space of difficulty and fear, that's where I find narrative, necessity, and purpose. So, like I said, I thought I'd start with just a piece of the first story in my book, and it's called The Finklestein Five. Fila, the headless girl, walked toward Emmanuel, her neck jagged with red savagery. She was silent, but he could feel her waiting for him to do something, anything. Then his phone rang and he woke up. He took a deep breath and set the blackness in his voice down to a 1.5 on a 10-point scale. Hi there, how are you doing today? Yes, I did recently inquire about the status of my application. Well, all right. Okay. Great to hear. I'll be there. Have a spectacular day. Emmanuel rolled out of bed and brushed his teeth. The house was quiet. His parents had already left for work. That morning, like every morning, the first decision he made regarded his blackness. His skin was a deep, constant brown. In public, when people could actually see him, it was impossible to get his blackness down anywhere near a 1.5. If he wore a tie, wing-tip shoes, smiled constantly, used his indoor voice, and kept his hands strapped and calm at his sides, he could get his blackness down as low as 4.0. Though Emmanuel was happy about scoring the interview, he also felt guilty about feeling happy about anything. Most people he knew were still mourning the Finklestein verdict. After 28 minutes of deliberation, a jury of his peers had acquitted George Wilson Dunn of any wrongdoing whatsoever. He had been indicted for allegedly using a chainsaw to hack off the heads of 5 black children outside the Finklestein Library in Valley Ridge, South Carolina. The court had ruled that because the children were basically loitering and were not actually inside the library reading, as one might expect of productive members of society, it was reasonable that Dunn had felt threatened by these 5 black young people, and thus, he was well within his rights when he protected himself, his library-loaned DVDs, and his children by going to the back of his Ford F-150 and retrieving his Hawtech Pro 18-inch 48cc chainsaw. The case had seized the country by ear and heart and was still, mostly, the only thing anyone was talking about. Finklestein became the news cycle. On one side of the broadcast world, anchors openly wept for the children, who were saints in their eyes. On the opposite side were personalities like Brent Kogan, the ever-gruffed and opinionated host of What's the Big Deal, who had said during an online panel discussion, yes, they were kids, but also fuck niggers. Most news outlets fell somewhere in between. On verdict day, Emmanuel's family and friends of many different races and backgrounds had gathered together and watched a television tuned to a station that had been sympathetic to the children, who were popularly known as the Finklestein Five. Pizza and drinks were served. When the ruling was announced, Emmanuel felt a clicking and grinding in his chest. It burned. His mother, known to be one of the liveliest and happiest women in the neighborhood, threw a plastic cup filled with Coke across the room. When the plastic fell and the soda splattered, the people stared at Emmanuel's mother. Seeing Miss John that way meant it was real. They lost. Emmanuel's father walked away from the group, wiping his eyes, and Emmanuel felt the grinding in his chest settle to a cold nothing. On the ride home, his father cursed. His mother punched honks out of the steering wheel. Emmanuel breathed in and watched his hands appear, then disappear, then appear, then disappear as they rode past streetlights. He let the nothing he was feeling wash over him in one cold wave after another. But now that he'd been called in for an interview with Stitches, a store self-described as an innovator with a classic sensibility that specialized in vintage sweaters, Emmanuel had something to think about besides the bodies of those kids severed at the neck, growing damp and thick, pulsing, shooting blood. Instead, he thought of what to wear. In a vague move of solidarity, Emmanuel climbed into the loose-fitting cargos he'd worn on a camping trip. Then he stepped into his patent leather Space Jams with the laces still clean and taut as they weaved up all across the black tongue. Next, he pulled out a long ago abandoned black hoodie and dove into its tunnel. As a final act of solidarity, Emmanuel put on a gray snapback cap, a hat similar to the one two of the Finklestein Five had been wearing the day they were murdered, a fact George Wilson Dunn's defense had stressed throughout the proceedings. Emmanuel stepped outside into the world, his blackness at a solid 7.6. He felt like Evel Knievel at the top of a ramp. At the mall, he looked for something to wear to the interview, something to bring him down to at least a 4.2. He pulled the brim of his hat forward and down to shade his eyes. He walked up a hill toward Canfield Road, where he'd catch a bus. He listened to the gravel scraping under his sneakers. It had been a very long time since he'd had his blackness even close to a 7.6. I want you safe. You gotta know how to move, his father had said to him at a young age. Emmanuel started learning the basics of his blackness before he knew how to do long division. Smiling when angry, whispering when he wanted to yell. Back when he was in middle school, after a trip to the zoo where he'd been accused of stealing a stuffed panda from the gift shop, Emmanuel had burned his last pair of baggy jeans in his driveway. He'd watched the denim curl and ash in front of him with unblinking eyes. When his father came outside, Emmanuel imagined he'd get a good talking to. Instead, his father stood quietly beside him. "This is an important thing to learn," his father said. Together, they watched the fire until it ate itself dead. And that's that first story.